Page 20. Just what is going on here? Jews asked. It has been argued that Jews had no reason to be alarmed at the moral majority and other fundamentalist Christian supporters of President Reagan. After all, they also supported Israel, opposed communism and the Soviet Union, and supported the arms buildup. Regardless of how they got to that position, it coincided with the position of most Jews. The defense of Israel. The Armageddon story threw a garish light on the sources of that support. In the most influential version, which appears in the New York Times, one could read that the final battle would be in Israel, that millions of Jews would be wiped out, there are only 3 million in Israel, and the rest would be converted. And President Reagan's response did not indicate that such was only the thinking of a very minor enclave among the supporters of the Republican candidate. It might have been, but it received a sympathetic hearing at the top. The strong Democratic showing among the Jews, it may thus be argued, was an accident. But it is an accident that keeps on happening, despite the fact that Jewish economic interests have been out of line with their political choices for 30 years. I suspect it will keep on happening for a long time to come. The Republicans are the party of white Protestant America. It is not an America Jews understand very well. They settled for the most part in the great cities. Their neighbors were Catholic immigrants and other East European immigrants. They lived cheek by jowl with the expanding black population. There were severe conflicts with both. When Father Coughlin was at his height, attacks on Jews in New York and Boston by Irish Catholic youths were common, and we all know about the more recent tensions between Jews and blacks. Nevertheless, at the presidential level, all could inhabit the same party. It will be harder and take longer for Jews to live at ease with white Protestant America, and particularly with that part of it which makes up the new fundamentalist surge. It is not a form of Christianity that many Jews have direct experience of, or can easily understand. It is a tendency that makes them jittery. The Republicans are as trusted as the Democrats, perhaps more so on Israel, but when it comes to life at home, there is that somewhat strange element foreign to Jewish experience that seems to have settled in the Republican Party with support at the top. While that goes on, Jews will be uneasy voting Republican. Leon Wieseltier, literary editor, The New Republic. The Jews of America have made work for the neoconservative heresiologists. The neoconservative pain is rather poignant. It is still another example of their surprise, that nobody was listening when they were talking mainly to themselves. Page 21. For some the pain is so great it has induced denial. More congenial numbers are desperately sought, and like many things desperately sought, they are found. The truth, however, is incontrovertible. By a margin of about 2-1, the Jews rejected Reagan. This has produced a small orgy of liberal triumphalism. Nothing else about the election could have. Why did the Jews do it? There has been a great deal of rhodomantade about the lasting influence on American Jewish behavior of the biblical, prophetic, and/or rabbinic traditions. This is a little ridiculous. The small number of Jews who really are familiar with the biblical, prophetic, and/or rabbinic traditions voted for Reagan. I mean the Orthodox. I understand that Judaism is enjoying a revival among professional Jews, but the strong feeling of liberal Democrats for the Midrash Rabbah has yet to be demonstrated. Moreover, it is arguable that the canonical texts of Judaism, the rabbinic texts in particular, aid and abet the prejudices of conservatives, more than they aid and abet the prejudices of liberals. It would be best, then, to banish their religion from the discussion of Jewish behavior at the polls, as most Jews have overwhelmingly banished it from their behavior everywhere else a long time ago. Nobody derives their view of the Sandinistas from Rabbi Tarfan anyway. A better explanation is the explanation from self-interest. But what exactly about the Democrats conformed to the Jewish interest, and what about the Republicans did not? Writing in the New York Review of Books, Arthur Hertzberg observed confidently that the Jewish interest lies in social peace and justice in America and the world. I hope my fellow Jews had something a little more specific in mind when they voted for Mondale. Furthermore, there are in the ranks of the Democrats demagogues, as divisive as the demagogues in the ranks of the Republicans. Still further, while it is true that a majority of Jews appeared, for example, to favor a nuclear freeze, that tells nothing about whether they were right to do so. The popularity of a position has nothing to do with its merit. I happen to think that this majority of Jews was wrong, and that neither they nor the Democratic Party should congratulate themselves for this particular reason for rejecting Reagan. The Jews of America were probably correct to repudiate the recommendations of their neoconservative leaders. From the standpoint of support for Israel, the election of 1984 was an embarrassment of riches for Jews. Both Mondale and Reagan could be trusted and could be reached. Still, Jesse Jackson notwithstanding, the political culture of the Democratic Party remains more responsive to the Israel interest than the political culture of the Republican Party. And the same may be said of most of the other issues of concern to Jews. I have never understood exactly where that Republican paradise for Jews, of which conservatives speak, is to be found. I do not see Zionism in the boardrooms of the corporations. I do not see tolerance and unconditional respect in the churches of the fundamentalists. Their respect for the Jews is conditional upon the tarrying of the end of days, at which point Gog and Magog will get Irving Kristol, too. Still, those who believe that the Democratic Party as it is presently constituted, page 22, is the natural home of the Jewish community, do neither Jews nor Democrats a service. The truth is that the Jewish community of America is more or less homeless. There does not exist an American political party in which it may feel completely comfortable. The critical difference is that there is less work for Jews to do among the Democrats than among the Republicans. But not a whole lot less. The matters of defense spending and affirmative action, for example, remain to trouble an American Jew's sleep. The Jews were right to vote for the Democrats, but not enthusiastically. And having cast their lot with them, they must now help to reform them. In 1949, in a bout of what may be called premature neoliberalism, Lionel Trilling wrote that, "It has always seemed to me that a criticism which has at heart the interests of liberalism might find its most useful work not in confirming liberalism in its sense of general rightness, but rather in putting under some degree of pressure the liberal ideas and assumptions of the present time. The Jews' agenda exactly, and not only the Jews. In sum, Republicans need not apply. Democrats need sit up and listen. For the Jews are, for the first time in their American history, whether they know it or not, whether they like it or not, independents. That is the present state of the Jewish interest in American politics." H. J. Kaplan, founding editor, Geo Magazine, and a member of the publication committee of the Public Interest. It is Christmas morning, and I have a spooky feeling that something more purposeful than chance has contrived to deliver your little note today, although it is dated December 14th and has been languishing, apparently, in the stack of mail that has been growing against my neighbor's door. Now, neighbor having foreshortened her holiday, your letter has been delivered at a most propitious moment, a moment bathed in the glorious Christian music, which has been resounding in my study. Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti, and the famous 9 lessons from the great Gothic chapel of King's College, unfolding a story I know and have known since childhood. Angels pro tem, the children in the Cambridge choirs, sing hymns that I too, although not so melodiously, could sing. You are surveying the reactions of Jews to the 1984 elections, an interesting and important project, but this morning I'm not inclined to turn off the music. It reminds me that we live in Christendom, and that the message of this day is one of peace to men of good will. Besides, the title of your excellent quarterly implies that it is published by and for people whose concern with this world. Page 23. Proceeds from some sense of another one, whether it be supernaturally ordained or simply a deeper and less contingent dimension of the human enterprise as such. So let's put politics, with a small p dash, aside for the moment and address your question in the spirit of this day and this world. Before we do that, however, it is only fair that I declare my bias. I voted for Ronald Reagan, and for the usual reasons. The solutions he proposed and the coalition of ideas and interests he represented seemed to me to be preferable, on the whole, to those offered by his opponent. Does this mean, in the words of an editorial I read in the New Republic a few weeks ago, that, in contrast to the majority of my fellow Jews, I was voting my interests instead of my values? A stupid question is said to call for a stupid answer, but in this case the dichotomy proposed by the New Republic is profoundly stupid. In other words, it packs an enormous density of misconception about the relation of values to interests, about how and why people vote, and preconception about which Jews voted for whom and why, into a single lapidary phrase. So, while your illustrious confrere deserves a niche in Consumer's Report for having produced the most egregious bit of political idiocy in a highly competitive market, it is also to be congratulated for bringing us up short, so to speak, and forcing us to confront this question of why we voted as we did. Now, I might on some other day have pursued this line of thought by discussing Jewish concerns with respect to this or that specific issue, our foreign policy, for example, especially in the Middle East. Although we do not normally expect in our system that any presidential candidate or any political coalition will ever precisely represent our own judgment on every problem, or that, in any event, the candidate and tendency we have chosen will be able to bring to pass precisely what they have proposed, the fact remains that on such matters as the national defense, the economy, and the role of the federal government, the Reagan approach, once again, on the whole, seems to me sounder and better. For me, for my family, for Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists of all sexes, colors, conditions, and sizes. In our society, it is properly presumed that groups, regions, and individuals have their particular agendas, and that there is nothing infamous in that, and that, despite the deterioration of civility since the 60s, it would be incumbent on each of us to make our case in terms of the common weal. Today, however, with the 9 lessons from the King's College Chapel still ringing in my ears, the Reagan approach to this or that issue strikes me as less important than the opposition. He at least symbolizes to what Peter Berger called, a few years ago, the aggressive secularization of our society, a phrase that covers a multitude of sins about which there is little a president can do except, but is this an essential exception? Proclaim from his pulpit, urbi et orbi, who and what we are and would be as a people. Indeed, if any single proposition could motivate so complicated a choice, I would be inclined to say that mine was for the general reassertion of the conservative and, yes, the religious temper of our society. Page 24. The very factor that is alleged to have so vexed and worried my fellow Jews that a majority of them, in the manner of the new republic, held their noses and voted for Mondale, or voted their values instead of their interests, depending on which page you read. But did they really? It is not implausible. History leaves people stuck with anachronistic notions, and the American chapter of Jewish history began only a moment or so ago, at the end of a very long book. It was as an effect of the Enlightenment and under its influence that the Jews moved out of the European ghettos and into the mainstream of the Western world. In Europe, the Enlightenment was largely and actively anti-religious, which was not at all the situation in America, as de Tocqueville noted, and most Jews were or thought they would be safer and freer as the secular power of the churches declined. That turned out to be untrue or no longer true in the 20th century, and those who continue, after the experience of Bolshevism and Nazism, to believe it to be true are simply victims of cultural lag. Plausible or not, this explanation has the advantage of exonerating the Jews of an ancient accusation, namely, that they are more intelligent than other people. If it was the religious, or Christian, element in the Reagan coalition that alarmed them, more than, say, the third worldism of the Democrats, then they were voting neither their interests nor their values. They were voting their memories, which is like arming to fight the last war. The French have a saying to the effect that a scalded cat fears cold water, and this would appear to be what happened to many of my fellow Jews in the weeks preceding November 6th. They were alarmed and affronted by that dimension of the conservative movement, which proclaims itself Christian, reveres the Bible, and asserts the relevance and authority of the old ethical imperatives, not merely because they are socially useful, but because they are ordained by God. That all this should strike them as dangerous is doubly paradoxical. First, because the religiosity in question is largely compatible with their own, not in theological detail, of course, but in its general tonality and inspiration, and secondly because post-Enlightenment Christendom in America remains firmly anchored in the intention clearly expressed by our founding fathers that there be no established church in this nation, which would nevertheless be free, under God, as I used to recite, together with the Lord's Prayer, by the way, in the classroom of my public school, and would always provide a safe haven for naysayers, Jewish or not, political or religious, something that can hardly be said of the great secular movements that have made a charnel house of Europe since World War I. But a haven, in the case of the Jews, is not quite the right word. Although Christendom and Western civilization have not been precisely synonymous, they have been historically essential to each other. And in this sense, I think it fair to say that the Jews have not merely found refuge in America, not always a comfortable one, God knows. Page 25. They have also been a constituent element of it. Charter members, as it were. Without their ambivalence, their marginality, their refusal to submerge themselves in the mass, who can say that the special vocation of Christendom in America, the stubborn assertion of pluralism, and of the freedom and autonomy of the individual would have achieved the character for better or worse. That sets us off from all other peoples? Not I. But of course I have an interest, as the New Republic says. In any event, it could scarcely have escaped me, having somehow survived through much of this cruel and bloody century, that we Jews have fared better in countries that remain true to their traditional moral order, as it has evolved through self-scrutiny and reform, fidelity and change, in the manner of the West, than in those that have undertaken, in the name of class or race or social engineering or whatever, to create the new man who was to come, Nietzsche dixit, after the death of God. So the religious, indeed the Christian, dimension of Reagan's conservative coalition is hardly likely to put me off. On the contrary, as a Jew of the diaspora, I have a proprietary interest in Christendom, having helped to shape it. And surely you can see that I am not feeling very stiff-necked this morning. It has had some part in shaping me. Marshall J. Brieger, Special Assistant to President Reagan for Public Liaison. The weeks since the election have seen continuing debate over the statistics reflecting the Jewish vote. The exit polls conducted by the Washington Post and ABC News, the New York Times and CBS News and NBC News showed Jews favoring Walter Mondale over Ronald Reagan by 2-1, with Mondale winning 69%, 66% and 65% of the Jewish vote, respectively. The exit poll of the American Jewish Congress showed a 70-30 split in favor of Mondale. On the other hand, a nationwide exit poll commissioned by the National Jewish Coalition for Reagan-Bush showed Reagan winning 40.6% of the Jewish vote. Similarly, New York's Jewish Community Relations Council found that 38% of New York City's Jews backed the president. It is almost impossible for a layman to enter fruitfully this fray over percentages. Statistical analysis is best left to the experts who, it appears, are still battling over methodology and interpretation. I will just briefly note that there is substantial evidence the network's exit polls failed to capture the overwhelmingly Republican vote of the Orthodox Jewish community and, therefore, may have underestimated the actual Jewish vote for the president. Page 26. A number of issues played a role in shaping the Jewish vote. I would like to explore the four most important of these, in an effort to illumine the various forces currently acting on the American Jewish community. The role of Israel, the legacy of liberalism, the role of anti-Semitism, and the impact of the fundamentalist Christian movement. First, this year's campaign was unique in that Israel does not appear to have been a major issue. This does not mean, however, that American Jews were not concerned about Israel's future. The fact is that in 1981, 76% of those polled felt Jews should not vote for candidates unfriendly to Israel, and there is no intimation that the intervening years have changed this opinion. Indeed, many Jews have argued that a strong America is a predicate for a strong Israel, and have charged the neo-isolationist strain in the Democratic coalition with an obstinate refusal to recognize that the fate of Israel is bound up with the fate of the free world. These commentators see a parallel between the Reagan administration's global geopolitics and long-term capacity of America to support her allies abroad, Israel in particular. Nevertheless, November 6 showed that most Jews did not perceive their vote as a choice between geopolitical strategies with clear impact on Israel's destiny. They separated Mondale, the man, from the leftward-leaning views of the Democratic Party itself. A second observation is that while figures show the majority of Jews still pull the Democratic lever, the Jewish vote is no longer monolithic. Throughout the 1960s, from 80 to 90% of the Jewish vote consistently went to Democratic presidential candidates. Even in 1972, when only 38% of the popular vote went to George McGovern, 65% of Jewish voters supported him. Then again, in 1976, with neither Carter nor Ford perceived as particularly good or bad on Jewish issues, the traditional 3-1 vote in favor of the Democratic candidate was cast. In 1980, when 40% of Jews voted Republican, there was a strong negative feeling toward Carter's re-election. But in 1984, the Democrats had a particularly attractive candidate. Walter Mondale was a known commodity to the Jewish community and its leaders. Nevertheless, the Jewish prodigal return to the Democratic fold was partial only, around a 2-1 split instead of the traditional 3 or 4-1. Milton Himmelfarb of the American Jewish Committee has suggested, "I think it is possible to interpret 1984 as showing a new democratic norm among Jews that is lower than the old democratic norm. Whereas the Jewish vote for the Republicans was formerly about 1/4, It is now about 1/3. These results all suggest the beginning of a two-party system within the American Jewish community. This gradual movement toward a two-party affiliation is even more clearly reflected in attitudinal surveys. In the early 1970s, George Gallup found that 51% of Jews interviewed called themselves liberal. In 1980, a CBS New York Times poll found only 38% of Jews so identifying themselves. Page 27. Dr. Stephen M. Cohen has directed a National Survey of American Jews for the American Jewish Committee each year since 1981. His 1981 figures show that an even lower 32% of Jews were self-described liberals, while 16% called themselves conservatives, and 49% were moderates. And in 1984, Cohen found liberals constituting 35% of respondents, up 3% over 1981, nearly 25% identifying themselves as conservative, up almost 9%, with only 37% middle of the road. The same rightward shift has occurred in the general populace, though Jews are still left of Americans generally. While age group statistics are not yet available, there is some evidence that the vote of the Jewish elderly may have focused on domestic economic policy, more than that of Jews in general. Florida retirement communities like Century Village in Boca Raton registered a 10% increase in Democratic votes over 1980, and the vote in the elderly neighborhood of Brighton Beach in New York went 4-1 for Mondale. This overwhelmingly Democratic vote may stem from deeply ingrained voting patterns. Our grandparents have voted Democratic for decades and could be reliving old battles. Also, the immediacy of financial difficulties and fear over Social Security may have played a major role. While Jews are still considerably more liberal than non-Jews, they no longer see their tradition and fate as indissolubly bound to liberalism, nor does such a Jewish reflex adequately account for the Jewish vote. The importance of this partial realignment cannot be overemphasized. It opens up a dialogue in the Jewish community regarding communal ends as well as communal means. Until recently, a Republican vote by Jews was deemed by Jewish leaders to be a vote for selfishness. A Democratic vote was understood to be a vote for moral passion in fighting for others. Yet, in 1984, only 11.7% of Jewish Mondale voters cited social-related policies as the main reason for their vote. While it may seem naive to classify a call for self-interest as necessarily ignoble, after all, cannot one's self-interest coincide, at least in part, with the public interest? The fact is that the two-party voting pattern confirmed by this election reflects two alternate visions of the Jewish polity and its place in American life. These visions have yet to play themselves out. The third factor, the role of anti-Semitism, was not only one of the most surprising but also potentially the most significant. This was perhaps the first election in recent memory where the charge of anti-Semitism was leveled against a presidential primary contender from one of the major parties. That the candidate at issue was also the first black contender for the nomination of a major party made the response to these charges even more difficult. Ironically, this anti-Semitic sensitivity resurfaced at the same time Jews began to feel comfortable about both parties' commitment to Israel. However, the degree to which Jesse Jackson affected the vote for Reagan is difficult to quantify. Hyman Bookbinder of the American Jewish Committee has suggested, page 28, that had the election taken place in July 1984, before the Republican convention and the heat-up of the church-state issue, the vote may well have been 50-50. Jackson's presence certainly affected the debate within the Jewish community, as a review of Jewish newspaper accounts would make clear. Further, it likely reinforced the commitment to Reagan by those who were otherwise well-disposed. For many, however, the Black-Jewish alliance, a cornerstone of Democratic Party politics since 1948, was already frayed, torn by differences over quotas and an arguable increase in black anti-Semitism and Third World-style rhetoric. Nevertheless, by the time of the election, other issues came to occupy center stage. The exit polls did not even ask respondents about the Jackson factor. For, as the New Republic put it, in the end, Jewish voters decided that the specter of Jerry Falwell and the vision of a Christian America frightened them more than the specter of Jesse Jackson. This brings me to my final point, the effect of fundamentalist Christianity on the 1984 Jewish vote. Certainly, the emergence of fundamentalist Christians, as a political force, has provoked a strong reaction from the Jewish community. Even the fundamentalists' staunch support for Israel and Zionism has been greeted, as Irving Kristol has noted, with embarrassment in many Jewish quarters. There are three reasons for this response. One is the fact that this support derives, at least in part, from a theological view of Israel and the role Jews are seen to play in bringing the Messiah. Thus, the very notion of friendship with evangelicals makes many Jews uncomfortable. Gestures of goodwill are often taken to be preludes to proselytizing. Second, one cannot deny that antisemitism has theological roots in traditional Christianity. Historically, theological tolerance was perceived to exist in inverse proportion to Christian orthodoxy. It was liberal Christianity that desired ecumenical dialogue with Jewish groups. However, the recent involvement of many liberal Christian groups with liberation theology and revolutionary movements has changed this equation. There is clearly an element of role reversal in the fact that the fundamentalist community is offering solid support for Israel. At the same time, the liberal Christian community, particularly in its more radical manifestations, is tilting away from Israel and toward friendship with Third World anti-Zionist nations. The domestic social and political agenda of the fundamentalists also generates controversy among Jews. To return to Dr. Cohen's study, 70% of the respondents to his survey oppose even silent meditation in public schools, and 63% are opposed to tuition tax credits. As noted before, 87% are in favor of gay rights, and 80% support federally funded abortion. Each of these positions runs counter to the vigorous efforts of, for example, Reverend Falwell and his moral majority. The third and perhaps major source of tension is a difference of view regarding the proper relation between church and state generally. Page 29. There can be no doubt that the Jewish community's emotion regarding the church-state issue runs deep. The fears concerning the Christianization of America were so intense during the campaign as to have apocalyptic overtones. American Jews have, for many years, felt public expression of authentic religious doctrine, as opposed to popular religious sentiment, to be dangerous. Many seem to feel that calling attention to particularities will erode toleration and undermine pluralism. It is this fear, I think, which animates today's Jewish reaction to Christian revivalism. Even when we praise the fact that many Jews are turning back to our own tradition, we find ourselves uncomfortable with similar trends among Christian groups. Despite this, we must work to reduce the temperature of the church-state debate. Efforts must be made to develop a dialogue with the Christian fundamentalist community, which is, after all, some 50 million strong. Such a dialogue has more than theological significance. It can impact on the foreign as well as domestic interests of American Jews. Indeed, I believe it is potentially the most explosive political problem for American Jewry in the domestic arena today. This review of the recent election has, of necessity, been speculative. Beyond the four fundamental factors I have discussed, a number of specific practical observations may be made. 1. There appears to have already been a political realignment among Orthodox Jews. Voting statistics from religious Jewish districts, like Borough Park and Williamsburg, show 2-to-1 support for Reagan. The reasons for this are many and complex. The traditional Jewish community is more sensitive to the plea for traditional values, and more supportive of expanded rights for the religious. Also, observant Jews, urban in geography and most exposed to Black Jewish tensions, were strongly sensitive to the Jackson factor. 2. The view that a strong America is a predicate for a strong Israel is reaching real acceptance in the Jewish community. 3. Antisemitism is no longer perceived to be the solitary preserve of the right, in other words, conservatives. 4. There is now a critical mass of Republican Jews. 4 out of 8 Jewish senators are Republican, as are 6 out of 30 Jewish representatives, some from districts without a heavily Jewish population. And there exists an institutionalized Republican presence in the Jewish community, the Republican Jewish Coalition, which will continue this party-building process over the next 4 years. 5. We now have an opportunity for Jews and Blacks desiring rapprochement to come together publicly and privately to heal the rifts exacerbated during the campaign. This will require that both sides maturely take into account legitimate differences. Among other things, we must try to overcome the misperceptions that opposition to quotas is opposition to civil rights, and that support for developing nations requires obeisance to Third World anti-Zionism.